Okay, welcome back from lunch. The next topic is one that I think we don't talk about enough, so I'm quite excited to hear something about technical debt. So please welcome Martin Bäumer.
Thank you very much, Peter. Welcome to this talk about technical debt. Quite cool to see that so many people are interested in this topic. Honestly, I have to say, when I heard about technical debt, the first time I was very confused, and I'm still confused. So, yeah, the reason for me being confused was I heard different perspectives on technical debt, different opinions, totally different opinions. And that's always kind of confusing. I heard people saying, technical debt. I can use that term as an excuse for bad code. And I figured, hey, that's cool. I can do that too. And it turns out probably I was wrong. And then I heard people who totally worshipped technical debt. They worked their ass off to get down to some kind of zero debt value, whatever that is. Started refactoring and refactoring all over again without delivering any kind of value. So that's another perspective on technical debt. And then I experienced the third one, a one that is totally neglecting technical debt. We don't have to care about this. This is nerdy stuff. We should care about business. We care about delivering value. So the debt part, that's for the nerdy people in the basement. They can think about all this clean code and coming up with excuses why they cannot deliver anything. And so I was quite confused, as I said. So I started digging a bit and asked myself, what is it, technical debt? Is it really an excuse for bad code? And how should we deal with that? How do I identify technical debt? And then, even more important, the question, how to handle technical debt. But first, my name is Martin. I have been a developer since 2008. I have been working in different industries, currently in telecommunications again. Before that, quite some time in telematics and manufacturing. For the last couple of years, I have luckily focused on Java and not jumping around too much in other languages, which feels quite nice. And one of my favorite topics is, surprise, technical debt. So today we talk about that. When I think of debt, I see this one, a credit card. Who here has a credit card? Pretty common. We use it probably in daily life when we buy breakfast, before we go to work, when we buy lunch, when we book some train ticket, some flight ticket, and so on and so on. When I think of that, I see this one, an apartment. Unfortunately, not mine, but, well, I'm working on it. this is also kind of that, probably a bit larger than the one on my credit card. Probably I have to take a loan to be able to buy such kind of apartment. And when I see that, I think of this. So there are a lot of sweets here, obviously. I will just explain a bit. This is a TV show. It's called Lyxfällan. Is it on air right now? I don't know. I'm not following TV so much. But anyway, it's a show about people who kind of lost control over their finances. And then suddenly, those two guys on the right-hand side come in and help those people by, for example, visualizing. This is how much you spend on clothing, on food, on gaming, and stuff like this. So, if you end up in this situation, you're basically, at the end, liksom. So, these are 3 perspectives on the term that. So, maybe this helps us to find a bit of a definition. Here we have Ward Cunningham. He is actually the person who coined the term technical debt back in the 80s, maybe. And he says something like this: shipping a product is always like going into debt. A little debt speeds development, so long as it is paid back. The danger occurs when it's not promptly repaid. Another quite similar definition is by Philip Cruchten. Technical debt consists of design or implementation constructs that expedient in the short term, but that make future changes more costly or impossible. So it's like with credit card. The credit card helps us to be more flexible, but when we skip the limit on the credit card and have too much debt and buy all these nice things, then we are getting in trouble. And similarly is here, a little bit of that helps us to go into production faster. We don't have to over-engineer a quick fix. We can start with some kind of proof of concept, prototype thing to prove something, to go into production and to verify, is our idea right? So now we have a bit of a definition of technical debt. It's not very bad, but we have to handle it with caution. So now the big question would be to figure out what are the symptoms. How do we recognize the painful part of technical debt? And here I found a nice approach to get at least some picture, maybe not the whole picture, but some picture, what are possible symptoms of technical debt. And here I try to think in 4 different categories. The first one would be configuration management debt. So in this scenario, there's some person who is dealing with a product that runs in at least 2 different environments. Not so strange. We all do that in some way. Maybe we have 3 environments, maybe 5, but it's quite familiar. The problem comes in when we are working a bit sloppy. I have seen a scenario where we focused quite much on delivering to test, because that was very important at some point to get things running in test so that we can verify. And all of a sudden, after a couple of months, we realized we are ready for production, but damn, we have no production environment because we haven't set that up. So this will cause, of course, some delay because we have to wait until the production environment is production ready. Another scenario might be, or that's pretty common actually, that test environment and prod environment are significantly different. Not a bit different, but significantly different. I have seen scenarios where we had to manually modify YAML files for production, but just for production. Just one attribute was necessary, which was actually forbidden in test. So if we set a similar value in test, the deploy in test failed, but in production we had to explicitly check that it's there. Kind of annoying because it costs a lot of time. And then, of course, it can happen that there is a lot of manual work, and that hinders us to go to production smoothly. Another category is quality debt. Who has experienced this? Who has caused this? So, quite familiar scenario. The symptoms here are, again, manual work. This time it's not about configuration, but it's about manual testing. Ooh, we can try out some system out print line. That's always nice. Or we just use Postman to send some requests and double check visually if our response is as expected. Another symptom might be that all of a sudden you have 2 teams. One is for features and one is for maintenance. This can work for some period, but if it's permanent, then you have probably lost the fight against technical debt. Because it means basically there are so many issues, so many problems, so many defects that require a whole team to handle this. And this means basically 2 teams with different mindsets and different ways of working are working on one product, conflicting each other, of course, going into different directions. The maintenance team might even introduce new defects. So if we are on a road that we feel like, oh, a separate team is coming up. At first there was maybe one guy focusing mostly on defects for some period. Suddenly there are 3 guys. And suddenly all these 3 to 5 people start having separate meetings and starting a separate sprint backlog. Then that's a warning sign. Another problem is architecture and design. We might have aimed for this kind of stairs. Nice and smooth I see a carpet. The walls seem to be quite stable, freshly painted, and so on. But what we get is this. That we have gone wrong somewhere on the way. And the reason for this could be some kind of misunderstanding, probably a lack of communication between teams, quite some frustration also, or some over-engineering. Somebody started designing the perfect solution, but without delivering the value that was expected. Next category is platform experience. Yeah, that's actually a quite critical one. Platform experience means basically people who know what they are doing. And, well, every organization would like to have these. When I think of platform experience, that I think of this book. Anyone who has read it? At least some, yes. Quick summary. It's an organization not completely into development, but they have a development product, software product, that is supposed to be delivered, and they experience huge trouble in production. When the service fails, there is significant downtime. Tests are failing, so it's hard to get up to speed again. When a new version is deployed, other bugs, other defects are detected, so this seems kind of shaky. And there's one guy, those who read it, can you remember the name? Brand, I think. Brand. That's a guy who is very important in this whole game. He knows basically everything about the software. He knows how to deploy. He knows how to find defects. He has a lot of private scripts on his computer to do secret magic stuff. And the organization is basically depending on him quite much. So if you identify some kind of brand person in your organization, that's a warning sign. A person who knows pretty much everything, and definitely much more than other people who should do similar jobs. Another image would be silo thinking. Silos are good because they keep something self-contained, but silos in organizations can cause troubles. It means we have a lot of specialists focusing on one specific area. It might be necessary that we have those specialists because they can really help us to be good in one specific area. But if we only have specialists without communicating, without synchronizing, no one will ever get the whole picture, right? So if you feel like there are two people pretty competent but never talking to each other, even though they should, then that's a warning sign. Now I have talked a bit about potential symptoms. There are probably a bit more. Classical symptoms would be people leaving the company, people not wanting to join the company because they heard that the product is kind of difficult to handle, and so on. But I will not go deeper into these. Just keep in mind these 4 categories. I think that's a good basis to start digging for technical debt. Now we talk a bit about what we actually can do to ease the pain, so to say. Unfortunately, there are no pills. There's no framework, J-fix or J-pill, not yet at least. So we have to find other ways. But first, we have heard about different symptoms now. And do I have to be scared? Do I have to be worried now? And stop thinking about delivering value, just technical debt? Ooh. No. There are some simple rules and mindsets how to handle technical debt. And one of them can be summarized in one sentence. If I do not incur interest, the technical debt is probably not that critical. That means if I don't experience trouble right now or in the near future, then this issue or the item that I consider an issue is probably not that dangerous. Another thing to think about is technical debt depends on the future evolution of your system. I mean, if the business is not going in a certain direction, if the business is not planning to support multiple languages for your user interface, you probably don't have to think too much about some internationalization and stuff. If the business, however, sees some market opportunity to grow from an English-speaking market to, let's say, German-speaking market, then it might be good to consider that. And then it can become technical debt. But as long as the future of my system doesn't require certain changes, I don't have to care so much about it. These are basically 2 pragmatic mindsets. It's always good to keep that in mind before getting scared. But still there are quite some tools that we can actually use to work with technical debt. And of course, first, it's worth to find ways to analyze the status quo of our technical debt. And here we can use Martin Fowler, or his idea of the technical debt quadrant. Let's see. Here we have basically 2 axes. The horizontal axis is between 2 extremes, prudent to the right-hand side and reckless to the left-hand side. And we have some vertical axes between intentional and unintentional. So if we are acting intentionally reckless, it's like saying we don't have time or we don't need to do that. We don't have time for testing. That's just useless effort. We can test manually, visually. That's probably a huge warning sign. Then, of course, you can be unintentionally reckless. Sounds kind of stupid. Well, it is stupid. But it basically means incompetence, carelessness. Incompetence sounds bad, but well, 12 years ago, I have been a junior developer, so I was probably careless. I wanted just to make some code, compile. I didn't think of or didn't know of best practices, like solid principles. Who learns that stuff at university, right? Or some kind of dependency injection. Never heard of it. So I was probably considered careless and incompetent. And I was careless and incompetent because I didn't know so much about certain frameworks and best practices and so on. But it's still kind of a depth issue because I have to think now about how to compensate for that. Now we are moving to the right-hand side of the quadrant. Now we are acting intentionally and prudent. That's actually this kind of behavior that we want to have. It means we know this is kind of crap. We know we have to fix it, but we also know we have to go into production pretty soon. So what we are doing here is we are probably deploying some quick fix or whatever you want to call it, but at the same time we are planning for extra effort after the release, say next sprint or whatever, to fix certain issues so that we don't compromise future development. So at some point we are acting intentionally bad, but we know it and we plan for it to fix it. And the fourth type of cause for technical debt is when we are acting prudent and unintentional. That means we are still, causing some trouble unintentionally. And afterwards, we realized, okay, now we actually know how we should have done it. That's kind of besserwisser mentality, but it can be also useful, at least if we manage to learn something out of it, so that the next time we can act intentionally, that we know what we are doing. So keep that in mind when you think about what kind of debt do we have in our system and what might be the reasons. Not all of them are bad per se, and there is always probably some explanation for that. Another way of analyzing stuff is just a quick reference. A guy named Adam Thornhill, a guy from Sweden, he has written a book called Your Code is a Crime Scene. Anyone who has heard of it, read it, it's pretty cool actually, because it's about analyzing your code based on data from your version control system. He focuses a lot on Git, but it's also possible with other systems if you prefer that. And just as an example, based on the data that we can pull from the history of Git, for example, we could maybe get to this kind of visualization. And in this example, I will not go into detail very much, but it's saying all these building blocks are basically classes. They represent classes of our system, and the form and the color and the size indicate certain kind of trouble. For example, we all see the large blue one kind of in the background, more to the left-hand side. It could mean that this class needed a lot of changes due to defects and fixing defects. So this class could be kind of cumbersome. This class needs maybe some reviewing, some refactoring, so that we can lower the trouble later on. This is just a simple example. As I said, Your Code as a Crime Scene, wonderful book. You can get a lot of useful data out of it. And it's real data, because it's from your version control system, right? So nothing to make up. So what can we actually do to handle this kind of issues? I mentioned 4 different categories. And what we can do for having better configuration management is to strive to configure early all environments that are relevant to us. We can strive for deploying early and often, even in production, even if it's not really used yet, but it helps us to feel more safe. We know this will work when we finally put it into production and publish some interface. And of course, automation can help, because it will help to eliminate problems that can be caused by manual work. Another thing is to accept the fact that all code matters. I mean, nowadays we all have some kind of DevOps team, or whatever you want to call it. These people produce code, so why should we handle these development processes differently to some other software development process? Here we have to apply also principles like having some kind of staging environment for all the tooling that is used by multiple teams to verify that these tools actually work. And last but not least, we need to put more responsibilities to the dev team, so we can actually get rid of dev and ops, and then it's getting DevOps for real, not 2 separate teams, and then talking about some kind of DevOps. How can we handle quality? Earlier we had a presentation on refactoring, some kind of Sudoku game. Marcus was talking about clean code, not so much about solid, but anyway, clean code and solid and other principles can help us to work more effectively with our technical debt, because clean code is about making code understandable for my colleagues and for my future self. And that's definitely necessary, because when I look at my code in 2 days, well, I will be lost. Another way of thinking, this is more about mindset and not about principles. It's to avoid big plan up front and to think more of that the code base evolves over time. I don't have to find a solution for some feature request in the first try. I just don't sit there and start at line 1 in my new, nicely clean Java class, and then I start coding, and in the end, bam, it's fixed. Probably my code will evolve. Probably there will be some not so nice parts in this class or in my system. But when I have the mindset that I will, or my team will, evolve the code, it's much easier to handle. Then I know, okay, there are some issues, but we know about them and we will handle them. And then another thing to handle quality debt is, of course, to have better automated testing and to establish some kind of habit of refactoring. I'm not very evangelistic about refactoring, so I don't do that every 5 minutes, because that's boring. But I know I have to do it once in a while. I know I have to re-evaluate my code. So I dedicate at least some time for it. When it comes to architecture, it's about validating early and designing continuously. Not so much about big plan up front, designing a couple of months, and then suddenly realizing that this won't work. Another way of thinking is to work need-driven and to sync with business. What are the actual plans for the future? What is the strategy for the next couple of months? What is most important for us? So that we as developers or architects can focus on the stuff that's mostly associated to that. Then a nice statement, I like it very much, even though I also hate it very much. It's, your design is one use case away from being invalid. That means our systems will probably change sooner or later. And, well, if we keep that in mind, our design will be probably a bit better. Thanks. Another nice technique to work on your architecture and design is the following: the cost of not addressing. It's also called abuse story. We can have a user story in our backlog that allows us to be totally evil. I like that. I can think of an evil user who wants to do some evil stuff to my system and my company, hacking some stuff. And what is the cost of not addressing this issue? So if I see some risk and what will happen if I don't address that? That's a good way to think about your technical debt. Because if I don't address it, there will be probably huge damage. Another question that I ask myself once in a while and that I hear quite often is about what is your biggest regret? I'm not talking teenage days and so on. What is your biggest regret in your current development? Probably you will have some old sins. Maybe it was a design decision 2 years ago and it sounded reasonably at that time, but now things have changed. And then you might think, with my knowledge now, I should probably change that. A classic example is calling a REST service, and suddenly there's a GraphQL interface, which might make the query simpler and increase performance. Maybe it was not available 2 years ago, but now it is available. So I might consider using this new API to increase performance, or some other issues. Maybe you decided to do some hard-coded things in the past because you didn't know, or there was time pressure, and from time to time it can be worth re-evaluating these old sins. And probably, I guess, we all find something in our past. Just look at your version control. How can we handle platform experience that? How do we get rid of brand, or not getting rid of him, but how can we use him in a better way, use his knowledge for the benefit of the whole organization? We can start pair programming. We can start introducing code reviews, maybe, so that more people than just brand know about our system. It will probably not happen in one day. Brand was very competent, but at some point you have to get started with this. Another way is to have so-called brown bag sessions, just some lunch, and learning from each other in some way, or explicit training. And what I like most actually is to experiment. In my current job, we have an initiative. We try to keep it stable. We call it Crazy Friday. If you don't want to be crazy, that's okay, but it's still worth it to experiment, especially on Fridays, because there will be Swedish fika in the afternoon, and before this fika session, you might want to experiment. And here we take the opportunity to work on some issues that we always wanted to work on. We try to investigate how to improve things. We work on knowledge sharing. How did you do this? Big change during the last sprint, and so on and so on. So it's pretty worthwhile, I guess. Okay, 5 minutes left, so time for famous or not so famous last words. I've talked about technical debt, and I can, based on my experience, I can say technical debt cannot be avoided. At some point, there will be some technical debt, as long as I'm not just working on Hello World. Technical debt is actually quite good in some scenarios, because it allows me, just like with the credit card, to be more flexible, to buy more stuff than I have actually money for on my bank account. There are certain, sometimes hidden symptoms, sometimes plain sight. We can handle that with a bit of metrics. I can really recommend Adam Thornhill on this subject. To some extent, technical debt is not so much about technical issues. I mentioned quality debt and configuration debt, but I think personally most of it has to do something with policies and mindsets. Because that's the hardest part to break if you want to handle your technical debt. Technical debt is not about blaming other people. It's about improving the product, the organization, our way of working, and so on and so on. And last but not least, I think technical debt is a cool topic. I like it very much. But we should not panic about it, but we should handle it in a pragmatic way. So keep your brain on and you will be fine. Okay, thank you very much.
There's time for one or two questions if you have any.
Do you have available slides for the talk?
Yes, they will be available later on through JFocus website.
Okay, thank you, Martin.